The crested gecko is a fascinating reptile from the tiny Pacific islands of New Caledonia. Here, these animals experience seasonal variation through a wet season and a dry season. Despite being some of the most popular pet reptiles across the world, this seasonal variation has been hugely overlooked in captive care advice. In our first documentary, we explored the ecology and natural habitat of crested geckos. This time, we're going back to New Caledonia to learn how environmental changes impact wild geckos and how we can best replicate this in captivity. Returning to New Caledonia felt special. Previously, we visited this beautiful archipelago in March, the height of the wet season. Great for reptiles, terrible for getting a tan. UVI was consistently low, temperatures were high, and it rained just about every hour. Arriving in Noumea, we knew things would be different this time. The sun was shining, the political unrest had subsided, and we finally experienced the postcard picture of New Caledonia. But what would this mean for reptile activity? After a few days in Noumea, we boarded the ferry to the Isle of Pines to find out. This video is brought to you by Blue River Diets, the UK's best-selling crested gecko diet brand. The Isle of Pines is only around 50 miles squared and is characterised mostly by tropical evergreen forest. The highest point on the island is only 260 metres above sea level, but the habitat is quite different to the lower elevations. So we're at the high elevation point of Pikenga in the Isle of Pines. This is the highest elevation area on the island, and you can tell by the macu shrubland here, the classic mineral rich soils that are creating sort of orange rocky ground, rocky terrain, very different to the bottom of the sort of lower elevations. And these panoramic views are just insane. Look at this. After checking into our hotel, we picked up the keys to our car and headed out on a hike through prime habitat where we had previously found crested geckos. It wasn't long before we made our first observations of the trip. Fruit seemed to be more abundant in the cooler months. October is spring in Australia, and there were parallels between there and New Caledonia. We noticed dozens of fruiting trees, berries and seeds. Some were instantly recognisable, but with such high rates of endemism on the island, many had to be identified on our return. Crested geckos also feed on insects, and we found far fewer of these in the dry season. During wet season, crickets could be found on the edge of leaves, snails adorned every surface, and moths and cicadas would fly relentlessly at our torches. Dry season felt like an entirely new ecosystem. We noticed a direct correlation between flying insect abundance and rainfall, and more humidity meant more bugs. We also found more insectivorous gecko species in the wet season and more frugivorous species in the dry season. Offering an increased variety of live foods during an artificial wet season, particularly flying insects that are challenging to catch, may be beneficial to captive geckos. Another key feature within this habitat is ferns. There are lots of species throughout New Caledonia and a few dozen on the Isle of Pines. The two most prominent species are basket ferns and bird's nest ferns. These epiphytic plants occur from ground level up to the canopy, including the understory where crested geckos are found. Ferns capture lots of leaf litter, creating the ideal environment for laying eggs, as well as attracting nutritious insects into those decomposing leaves. Aside from the fruiting trees mentioned, ipple trees and paperbark trees were both ubiquitous. Other Australasian hardwoods also have unique bark that may offer protection to juvenile crested geckos, as well as camouflage for leachianus geckos, rough-snouted geckos and chahua geckos. We also decided to test the soil pH to understand how nutrients pass into this fruit. So we're in the exact location where we found a crested gecko last night, and we're trying to learn as much as possible. So we've been photographing all the plants out here. We've also been documenting the types of leaf litter, but substrate obviously consists of the soil here as well. So you can see here, it is just basically sort of, soil, organic matter, and there's only really a couple of layers of leaf litter, so maybe a couple of inches. So we're going to test the pH of this soil and see whether that can teach us any more about the plants, the nutritional value of the plants, and the ecosystem that these crested geckos occupy. so the soil here is ever so slightly alkaline, which is interesting because it means that the nutrients, especially things like magnesium and calcium, can be absorbed into the plants much easier. Now, these components are extremely important for crested geckos' well-being, and they are key ingredients in blue river diets and reptile supplements. The Isle of Pines sits on a huge calcium-rich limestone deposit made primarily of ancient coral. The limestone gives the substrate excellent drainage. It may also provide extra calcium provisions within the flora. We're stood in one of the Isle of Pines' famous grottos, which is basically a cave, and you can see this beautiful rockwork, this limestone rock that we're finding in the same locations as the crested geckos, so that is a big part of the substrate out here. And although we're not likely to find any geckos here, it's interesting to see these beautiful formations and make assumptions about the type of substrate that we could be using in captivity. Sunlight is dynamic and constantly shifting within the forest. Small patches of dappled light offer intense infrared and ultraviolet light. As clouds pass over, that UVI also changes. We aim to take readings within sunny patches throughout the day and found on average that UVI would increase sharply from 9 AM and reach 6.38 by 11 AM and then gradually fall throughout the afternoon until sunset at about 5:50. In contrast, excessive cloud cover in the wet season meant UVI averaged between 0.5 and 3 across all readings. This could have been a particularly cloudy period, but there was a distinct difference in UV levels between the wet and the dry season. The temperature was far less contrasted. It remained relatively consistent throughout both seasons, however winter saw more contrast between the day and night temperatures. For this reason, using supplementary heat from a spot bulb that also provides visible light through the middle of the day could be an effective way to mimic patches of sunlight. The greatest seasonal difference was observed in humidity. During wet season, humidity always remained above 80%. In dry season, it fell to around 55% most days, increasing gradually to 75% at night. Behind me here is a dried riverbed. Now, when we were here in the wet season, this river was running pretty fast actually. So we've had 7 minutes of rain so far on the Isle of Pines, which compared to the wet season when it was basically every hour, this is a completely different environment. You can see obviously the dried riverbeds make it very dynamic. This is something that will change throughout the year, but also humidity, rainfall, and everything else that's impacted by rain, which is just about everything in the tropics, is changing. Eventually, we did experience slightly more rain than 7 minutes, but this totaled no more than 2 hours over 3 weeks. It wasn't long before we saw some geckos. Crested geckos were most frequently observed at the ends of branches. This may offer a level of protection against the heavier bodied leachianus geckos that prey on them. They typically assume this position amongst leaves which are a similar size and shape to the gecko. Without a tail, these lizards can look surprisingly like leaves. This possibly offers some camouflage from aerial predators. Where most giant geckos of New Caledonia have developed flanges and mossy coloration to blend into the bark, it could be that Correlophus found its niche as a leaf mimic instead. Regardless, this gives us insight into the way we should build terraria. Filling the environment with lots of leafy branches with thin stems to offer security rather than bulky cork bark tubes. We found crested geckos on both expeditions across both seasons. However, the geckos adapted their activity hours to utilise the milder temperatures and higher humidity. In wet season, geckos were active early, even during the day. In the dry season, they were active late at night when humidity had increased and temperatures had fallen. Geckos also seem to be higher in the canopy during dry season, perhaps to assume positions of higher humidity. Across both expeditions, geckos were only active within small environmental parameters between 69.5 and 86% humidity and between 22.2 and 26.4 degrees Celsius. This aligns perfectly with captive care recommendations, but we mustn't forget that the wider environment experiences much greater fluctuations. These shifts direct the gecko's behaviour, and therefore we should offer wider environmental parameters whilst also maintaining microclimates for the animal to shelter in. Of course, crested geckos were not the only species we found during the expedition. Check this out, these are the endemic New Caledonian sea kraits, a species found only here in New Caledonia. They look very similar to the yellow-lipped sea krait, but there is a slight difference in the scalation. So the New Caledonian species actually has more scales around its body, but they are very similar. You can see they are sexually dimorphic, so it looks like there's a huge female in here, as well as a couple of smaller males, which makes sense. That's probably what's happening here, is the males are approaching the female, potentially looking to breed, and she's just trying to get away up on these coral outcrops. It's an incredible thing to see. They're lapids, so they possess highly toxic venom. They are related distantly to things like cobras and black snakes, and their venom has to be toxic so that it can neutralize fish while they're swimming quickly, and then they can consume them. Now, interestingly, sea kraits actually feed on fish that are almost as large as them, if not larger. They feed on moray eels and all kinds of unique prey. So they need that venom to neutralize it quickly and then consume their prey. Interestingly, we also found the gecko diversity changed. In wet season, we found lots of bovia geckos and pelagic geckos, whereas in dry season, we found none. And we found more New Caledonian Giant Geckos and Chahua geckos, which we didn't find in the wet season. Behind me here are bugney trees. They are what basically greets you off the ferry here in Isle of Pines. They are iconic, massive trees with super wide-reaching branches. They're extremely robust. And when we talk about leachianus geckos living up in the canopy, they're pretty symbolic of that kind of thing. So obviously the leachies will be up in all kinds of trees, but it gives you an idea of the height of some of these trees over here. So unlike some of the other habitats on Grande Terre, where you find sort of other, gargoyle geckos and things like that are much lower down to the ground, these sort of massive trees on the Isle of Pines are really where the leachianus are. The crested geckos, on the other hand, they're on the understory. They're a little bit lower down. And it just shows the ecological niches of the different geckos out here in New Caledonia. Unfortunately, in captivity, in captivity, we tend to keep all the New Caledonian geckos in a very similar way, and in actual fact, they all occupy very distinct ecological niches. The geckos of New Caledonia are still illegally trafficked. Whilst there is little motive for poachers to target low-value crested geckos, demand for other species has grown. Some of these species have been legally exported and bred, some have not. Please only source verified captive bred animals and actively report illegal activity. New Caledonian authorities are extremely vigilant to suspicious activities on the island, and whilst this does mean that all reptile enthusiasts are scrutinised, it was refreshing to see such stringent anti-poaching protocols on the islands. But as responsible reptile keepers, we must also govern our hobby from abroad. Crested geckos are threatened by a variety of human-related activities, from deforestation and habitat degradation to the long-term effects of invasive species including fire ants, rats and domesticated pets. So we're just on the way back from our surveying spot now, and in the space of about a 20-minute drive, we've actually seen 6 different cats on the road. There's a 7th one just here. Obviously these domesticated cats are a big threat to geckos. They've evolved for millions of years without these threats, and now cats are on the Isle of Pines and they decimate wildlife. They decimate wildlife all over the world, but here on this very small island where populations are very fragile, the cats, it's upsetting to see every single cat that we have seen. And also, we've seen probably 4 or 5 rats as well as we've been walking through the surveying site. Again, that's another threat to some of these small docile geckos, and also the fire ants as well. They pose a threat too, especially to some of the smaller species. On this trip we haven't seen any Rhacodactylus, and I know that they are seriously impacted by the introduction of fire ants. We've also seen mourning geckos around our hotel. They don't seem to be competing with any of the sort of crested geckos or any of the larger geckos. Perhaps there's competition with Bavaria in some locations, I'm not sure, but again, you know, these are all species that shouldn't be here, and it's you know, down to humans to that have introduced these potentially very damaging fauna onto the Isle of Pines. Of course, crested geckos don't just live on the Isle of Pines. They can also be found on the main island of Grande Terre. The Blue River Park covers various altitudes from about 150 metres above sea level right up to about 1,250 metres above sea level. And across these different altitudes there'll be different environments. So the humid forest is typically that bit higher up, and here we can actually see that it is very cool here. It's actually been around 21 degrees all morning. Now it's already like 10:30, 11 o'clock, and it's 22 degrees, which is strikingly different compared to the lower altitudes, where by this time we've been recording temperatures typically 30 plus. It's also slightly different to the habitat on the Isle of Pines, where generally it was that little bit more warmer than what we've experienced here. Interestingly, crested geckos occupy both habitats, and even the humidity here is sitting at around 89.8%, which is very, very humid, and almost 20% more humid than what we were recording on the Isle of Pines. This obviously shows the versatility of crested geckos, and while this humid kind of forest is a good benchmark for how to keep them, clearly crested geckos are quite versatile in their habitat usage, and they are reasonably hardy for different conditions, which is perhaps why they're such popular pets and why they're excellent beginner reptiles. We spent a further week on Grande Terre learning more about montane ecosystems and the habitat of gargoyle geckos, and even visited some new leachianus localities. We can't wait to share some of these observations with you in our next production. For extra care advice, data sheets from the expedition, plant catalogues, photography and more, check out the Blue River Diet's website, and to keep up to date with future videos, be sure to follow this page.